In the middle of a blinding snowstorm, a young single mother made a choice to stop for a shivering old man stranded on the side of the road, even if it meant risking the one chance she had to save her own family. She didn't know that her act of kindness would spark a chain of events she never saw coming. Nights spent scrubbing dishes until her hands bled, and then, one quiet morning, a phone call that would change everything. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about a mother's sacrifice. It's a story about how kindness never goes unnoticed, even in the fiercest storms. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Mary Cooper woke before dawn, as she always did. The apartment was cold, its thin walls doing little to keep the winter outside. She moved quietly, careful not to wake her son, Nathan, still curled up under a faded blanket in the next room. It was a morning like any other, but for Mary, it felt different. Today was the day she would change her life, or so she told herself as she pulled on her only decent coat. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking steady and unbothered. Unlike the anxious flutter in her chest, the job interview was her chance, the one chance she couldn't afford to miss. A position at a logistics company just outside of town, full-time, with benefits. It meant security, or at least the promise of it. Mary's hands trembled as she fixed her hair in the cracked mirror above the sink. She tried to imagine what the manager would see: a young woman with tired eyes and a desperate hope that went deeper than any resume. She had rehearsed her answers a dozen times in her mind, each one more careful than the last. Nathan stirred in his sleep, and Mary paused. She leaned into his room, brushing a kiss over his forehead. "Today's going to be a good day," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. Outside, the world was a wall of white. The snow had been falling all night, and now it covered everything in a thick, relentless silence. Mary pulled her scarf tight around her neck and stepped out into the cold, her breath a pale cloud in the dim morning light. The drive was slow. The old car groaned at every turn, its heater blowing more cold air than warm. Mary gripped the wheel with both hands, her knuckles pale against the cracked leather. She had to make it. She told herself this over and over, each word a prayer. She had to make it to that interview no matter what. But fate had other plans. She was half an hour from the office, the snow coming down harder, when she saw him. An old man, standing by the side of the road, hunched against the wind. His coat was thin, far too light for the storm that raged around him. He held one gloved hand up, as if to shield his face from the biting cold. Mary could see the way he shivered, how he leaned into the wind as if it might push him over. The car he had been driving sat half buried in a drift. Steam rose from the hood in slow, desperate clouds. She saw the back tires spinning uselessly, the engine coughing in protest. Mary's heart twisted. She knew what it felt like to be stranded, to have nowhere to go and no one to turn to. But this was her day, her one chance. She could pretend she didn't see him. She could drive on and leave the old man to the snow, but she didn't. She pulled over, her tires slipping as she eased the car to the shoulder. The old man didn't move at first, as if he didn't believe anyone would stop. Mary rolled down her window, the cold air cutting through the thin coat like a knife. "Sir," she called, her voice shaking. "Do you need help?" He turned slowly. His face was lined, eyes pale and tired. Snow clung to his lashes, his lips a thin, determined line. "I'm trying to get home," he said softly. His voice was rough, like gravel. "My car won't start." Mary hesitated. The clock on her dashboard told her she would be late if she stayed. But the man's eyes, there was something in them she couldn't look away from. She opened her door and stepped out. The wind bit at her face, the snow stinging like needles. "Come on," she said, holding out a hand. "Let's get you warm." He didn't argue. He moved stiffly, each step an effort. Mary took his arm and guided him to her car, helping him into the passenger seat. Inside, the heater rattled, but it was better than the cold outside. The old man Henry, he told her in a quiet voice, held his hands out to the vents, shivering. "Thank you," he said. I didn't know what I was going to do. Mary nodded, swallowing hard. She turned the car back onto the road, her mind racing. She thought of the job, the bills waiting at home, Nathan's face that morning when he asked if she'd be back in time to tuck him in. She glanced at Henry. His eyes were closed, lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps just a wordless gratitude. Mary's hands tightened on the wheel. She knew the choice she had made. She knew she would be late, maybe too late, but she couldn't leave him. She couldn't drive past and pretend he wasn't there. She drove on, the storm swallowing the road in front of them. Each mile was a battle, the snow blinding, the wipers struggling to keep up. Mary's heart thudded in her chest, every beat a reminder of the risk she had taken. In her mind, she could hear the echo of her own thoughts, the silent, desperate bargain she had made. Help him, and trust that somehow it will be okay. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Beside her, Henry let out a soft sigh. God bless you, he murmured. Mary didn't answer. She just kept her eyes on the road, her hands steady, her breath slow and even. She would get him home. And then somehow she would find a way to keep going. Because if there was one thing she still believed, even in the coldest storm, it was this: kindness mattered. Even when no one was watching, even when it felt like the world had forgotten how to see. Mary kept driving, her eyes fixed on the narrow strip of road the headlights carved out of the storm. She didn't know exactly where Henry's home was. He had mentioned a small town 2 counties over, but the snow blurred every landmark. Still, she didn't turn back. Henry sat beside her, his hands still trembling from the cold. He looked out the window, but there was nothing to see, just white swirling endlessly against the glass. For a while, they drove in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Henry spoke. I served in the war, he said quietly, his voice more memory than sound. Vietnam seems like a lifetime ago. Mary didn't interrupt. She just nodded, her eyes never leaving the winding road ahead. She knew the weight of old stories, the way they clung to a person long after the world stopped listening. I was just a kid when they sent me. Henry continued. He rubbed his palms together, as if the motion might warm more than his skin. I came back with more ghosts than metals. The snow fell harder. Mary slowed the car, her fingers aching from gripping the wheel so tight. She wanted to say something, to tell him that she understood in some small way, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she offered him the only thing she could, a quiet space to speak, without judgment, without hurry. Henry's shoulders dropped, just a little. My wife used to say I never really came home. He murmured. She passed 2 winters ago. Since then, the nights feel longer. He let out a breath, fogging the window. Mary swallowed, her throat tight. She knew about long nights. She knew about the silence that settles in when there's no one to share it with. She glanced at him, the lines of his face etched deeper by the flickering light of the dashboard. You shouldn't be out here alone, she said softly. It's too cold, too dangerous. Henry managed a faint smile. I didn't plan on it, he said. But sometimes the world forgets you before you're ready to let go. Mary said nothing. She didn't need to. She understood. The miles slipped by slowly. Outside, and the world was a blur of white and gray. Inside the car, the air grew warmer, filled with the quiet rhythm of 2 people sharing a single purpose. Mary kept her focus sharp. She told herself over and over, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. She would see it through, not halfway, not almost. At a gas station on the edge of the county line, she stopped to fill the tank. The clerk looked at her like she was crazy. Out in a storm like this? But Mary just smiled faintly, wiping snow from her eyelashes. Back on the road. Henry closed his eyes. I don't know why you're doing this, he said, his voice soft, almost fragile. You don't owe me anything. Mary kept her hands steady on the wheel. She didn't answer right away. Then, in a quiet voice that felt truer than anything she'd said in days, she whispered, if you're going to do something kind, you have to do it all the way. Otherwise, what's the point? Henry turned his head, looking at her with eyes that seemed both surprised and deeply, deeply grateful. He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. The hours passed slowly, the darkness pressing in around them. At times, the snow was so thick Mary had to lean forward, squinting to see the faint edges of the road. Her shoulders ached. Her eyelids felt heavy, but she kept going. For Henry, for herself, for the belief that small kindnesses still meant something, even when the world was too busy to notice. Finally, Henry pointed out a turnoff, a narrow lane half hidden by drifting snow. "That's it," he said. "My house is just down there." Mary turned carefully, the tires slipping a little in the powdery snow. The headlights caught the shape of a small house, its porch light glowing like a promise. She pulled up in front, her breath catching in her throat. Henry looked at the house as if he were seeing it for the first time in years. He turned to her, his hands shaking as he reached for the door handle. "Thank you," he said simply. Mary just nodded, her heart full in a way she couldn't explain. She watched him step out, watched the snow swallow his footprints as he walked to the porch. At the door, he turned back once, a small, weary smile on his face before disappearing inside. For a moment, Mary sat there, the car idling softly, her hands resting in her lap. She felt the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones, but also something else, a quiet certainty. She had done the right thing. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the stillness wrap around her. Then she shifted the car into gear and turned back toward the highway. The storm had not let up. The world was still cold and dark. But Mary drove on, her heart steady, her resolve firm. She was late for her interview, too late. She knew, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She had chosen to help. She had chosen to see someone the world had overlooked. And no matter what waited for her back in the city, she knew she wouldn't change a thing. As she drove, she thought of Nathan. She thought of his small, hopeful smile and the promise she had made to herself to show him that kindness was never wasted. Not ever. The snow eased a little as she neared the city limits. The sky was still a deep, endless gray, but the wind seemed to soften, just a little. Mary pressed her fingers to the steering wheel, feeling the sting of fatigue, but also the quiet hum of something like pride. She pulled into her neighborhood as dawn broke over the horizon. The first faint light of day turned the snow to silver. Mary sat for a moment, staring out at the quiet street, the small, mean, weary houses that looked just like hers. She was late. She was tired, and she had no idea what came next. But she would keep going. Because if there was one thing she had learned, if there was one thing she wanted Nathan to know, it was this. When you choose kindness, you choose something bigger than yourself. Mary climbed out of the car, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The sun rose behind her, pale and gentle against the cold sky. And Mary, tired, worn, but unbroken, stepped forward into the day. Mary's world had shrunk to long hours and silent prayers. After missing the interview, she had no choice but to find whatever work she could. She took the night shift at a small diner washing dishes, and every morning she slipped into a cafe down the block to serve coffee and wipe tables. She moved through her days like a ghost. Sleep was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her son, Nathan, was too young to understand why his mother's hugs felt tired, why her eyes looked so far away. At night, Mary's hands burned from the scalding water, the endless clatter of dishes in the cramped kitchen. The steam fogged her glasses, and she wiped them away with the back of her wrist. Every shift felt like it might swallow her whole. In the early hours of dawn, she would walk home through streets still heavy with snow. Her shoulders ached under the weight of her worn jacket, her feet sore from standing, but she never let herself break, not where anyone could see. She would wake Nathan with a kiss, her voice soft and steady. She would pack his lunch with hands that trembled from exhaustion, and she would smile as she waved him off to school. No matter how tired she was, she never let him see the cracks. At the cafe, Mary's uniform smelled of old coffee and cold air, She tied her apron with fingers cracked and raw, the thin fabric barely covering the bruises of long nights. She greeted every customer with a smile that never reached her eyes. Her coworkers noticed the quiet way she worked, how she never complained. Some nights, she would slip out the back door for a breath of air, just to remind herself that the sky was still there. She would stand in the alleyway, letting the cold bite at her face, her breath fogging in the icy air. Mary told herself over and over this was only for now. She would find a way out. She had to. One morning, she stood in the cramped storage room behind the cafe. The fluorescent light flickered above her, a pale glow that made the shadows deeper. She was tying her apron, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion. When the phone in her pocket buzzed, she almost didn't answer. Calls usually meant bills she couldn't pay, another reminder of how far she had to go. But something a quiet pull made her reach for it. She pressed the phone to her ear, her heart pounding. "Hello," she said softly, her voice thin with sleep. For a moment, there was only static. Then a man's voice came through, warm and steady. "Is this Mary Cooper?" Mary's breath caught. "Yes," she whispered. "This is Michael," the voice said. "I'm the executive director at Harrison Logistics. My father, Henry, told me about the night you helped him." His words hung in the air, filling the cold room with something like warmth. Mary closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She remembered Henry's eyes in the darkness, the quiet way he had said thank you as she helped him home. She hadn't done it for this, she hadn't expected anything at all. "I'd like to meet with you," Michael continued, his voice gentle. "I believe our company could use someone like you, someone who understands what it means to care." Mary's hand tightened on the phone, her knuckles white. She tried to find her voice, but it trembled. I don't know what to say," she managed. Her eyes burned, and she pressed her lips together to keep from crying. "You don't have to say anything," Michael said. "Just tell me when you're free to come in." Mary looked down at her hands, the skin raw from endless scrubbing, the lines of quiet strength they carried. She swallowed hard, her breath shaking. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "I can be there tomorrow." The silence that followed was a soft, steady pause. Then Michael said, "I'll see you then, Mary," and the line went quiet. Mary lowered the phone, her hands trembling. In the dim light of the storage room, she let the tears fall silent, hot and full of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She wiped her face quickly, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. She turned back to the mirror, her reflection pale and worn but somehow brighter. She straightened her shoulders and tied her apron tighter. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was standing in the right place. Like maybe all the nights she'd spent invisible hadn't been for nothing. Like the world hadn't forgotten her after all. She stepped out into the cafe, the early morning light spilling across the worn floors. The customers were just beginning to trickle in, their voices soft with sleep. Mary smiled, a real smile this time, and greeted each one by name. She poured coffee with steady hands, her heart still echoing with the sound of Michael's voice. And as she worked, she thought of Nathan, of how she would tell him tonight that things might be different now, that maybe all the quiet goodness she had carried had finally found a place to belong. Mary didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. The hope in her eyes was enough. And in that small cafe, in the hush of early morning, she felt it bloom, a quiet reminder that kindness, even when it seems forgotten, has a way of finding its way home. Mary took the bus to the office the next day, her hands folded in her lap, a quiet calm settling over her. She wore the same coat she had worn that night in the storm, its fabric still marked by the wind and the snow. She didn't mind. The scars told the truth of who she was. She stepped into the building, her breath catching for a moment at the clean, warm light of the lobby. People hurried past, their polished shoes clicking on the tile. Mary walked slowly, her steps steady, her heart beating a quiet, determined rhythm. Michael was waiting for her at the front desk, his coat draped neatly over his arm. He smiled when he saw her, a soft smile that reached his eyes. "Mary," he said simply. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, her fingers brushing nervously over the edge of her coat. "Thank you for calling," she said, her voice quiet but clear. And in that simple exchange, something settled in understanding that didn't need many words. He led her down a quiet hallway, past offices that smelled of coffee and new paper. When they reached the interview room, he gestured for her to sit. Mary settled into the chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady. Michael sat across from her, a thin folder in his hands. He didn't rush. He didn't flip through the papers as if she were just another file. Instead, he looked at her directly, his eyes kind and patient. "Tell me about that night," he said gently. "Tell me why you stopped." Mary took a slow breath. She thought of Nathan, of the quiet apartment, of the way the snow had seemed to swallow the world whole. She thought of Henry's lined face in the glow of the dashboard lights. "I stopped because he was alone," she said softly, "because no one else did." She didn't embellish the story. She didn't speak of the fear or the exhaustion. She simply told the truth. She told him how she had driven Henry home through the dark, how she had watched his shoulders ease when they finally reached his porch. She told him how she had turned back for the city, her heart tired but sure, and she told him how she had known, deep down, that helping was the only choice she could live with. Michael listened without interrupting, his brow furrowed in quiet thought, but his eyes never left hers. There was no pity in his expression, only respect, only a careful, patient understanding. When she finished, the room fell silent. Mary felt her heart slow in her chest, her breath evening out. For the first time in weeks, she felt no need to apologize for what she had done. Michael closed the folder and set it aside. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table, and he nodded once. "I think," he said slowly, "that what you did tells me more about who you are than any resume ever could." Mary looked down, her throat tight. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He smiled then, that same quiet smile she had seen when she first stepped through the door. "We'd be lucky to have you here," he said softly. "If you're still interested, the job is yours." Mary blinked, her hands tightening in her lap. She nodded once, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said. "I'd be proud to." He stood, extending his hand across the table. Mary rose and took it, her fingers calloused and warm against his. It was a simple handshake, but it felt like something bigger, a promise, a beginning. In the weeks that followed, Mary settled into her new role with a quiet diligence. She worked hard, learning each task with care and patience. Her co-workers noticed the way she listened, how she carried herself with a calm that seemed to ease even the busiest days. Michael would stop by sometimes, checking in with a nod or a quiet word of encouragement. He never made a show of it, but each time he passed her desk, Mary felt the quiet weight of his respect, not because she asked for it, but because she had earned it. It wasn't long before word of her story began to spread. A local reporter wrote an article just a few paragraphs tucked into the community section of the paper. "Local Woman's Kindness Guides, Veteran Home in Snowstorm." The headline read, the story rippled through the town like a warm wind on a cold day. People stopped her in the grocery store, at the bus stop, their voices soft with wonder. "Was it really you?" they asked. Mary would just smile, her eyes gentle. "Yes," she would say quietly. "But it wasn't much. I just did what anyone should have done." And that was the truth. She hadn't wanted praise. She hadn't wanted to be noticed. But for the first time in her life, she felt seen, not for the work she did or the hours she kept, but for the simple choice she had made in the dark to help, without question or reward. Nathan would sit at the kitchen table each night, his eyes bright as she told him about her day. He would listen with the quiet seriousness of a boy who understood that some things were too important to be spoken lightly. And Mary would smile, knowing that he was learning that kindness was not a word, but a way of being. She still lived in the same apartment. The walls still thin, the nights still long, but something in her had shifted. She carried herself taller now, her steps sure, her shoulders no longer bowed under the weight of invisibility. She didn't need the world to see her, but it did. And in that quiet recognition, she found a kind of peace. On a cold spring morning, Mary stood at the window, the light soft against her face. She watched Nathan run down the sidewalk, his laughter echoing in the chill air. She pressed a hand to the glass, her breath fogging the pain, and whispered a small prayer of thanks. Because she knew now without a doubt that kindness was never wasted, that even the smallest light, shared freely, could find its way back. And that sometimes the quietest acts were the ones that changed everything. Mary turned from the window, a smile on her lips. She picked up her bag, her steps light as she headed out the door. And in her heart, she carried the simple, steady knowledge that her quiet kindness had found its way home, not with fanfare or noise, but with the gentle certainty of a promise kept. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.